Okay, great. I see the participants starting to populate the Zoom call here, so we'll just give it a moment to get everybody set up and then we'll get started. Great, we've got a big group this morning, so it's just going to take a moment or two more for everybody to get online and get ready to go. But we are very pleased that the wonders of technology allow us to connect so far and wide with so many people, and to have such great speakers become available to us up here in Northern Virginia, and allow us the opportunity to speak with elected members of Congress from all over the state. So we're really happy to have Congresswoman Elaine Luria with us this morning. And again, I'm just gonna wait a few more moments. I still see numbers ticking up of people joining, and as soon as that settles, we will go ahead and get started with our conversation. Well, let me just say good morning to you, Congresswoman Luria. Thank you for joining us from the Hampton Roads area. We are very pleased to have you with us today on this NOVA DemBiz call. I want to start by noting that Congresswoman Luria is a member of the Hampton Roads Democratic Business Alliance, and so she is very well acquainted with the format and with the membership of these affiliated groups of Democrats who understand that Democrats are actually better for business. And we are very pleased to be able to have her speak to our group this morning, coming to us from Norfolk. The run of show today is going to be, I'm going to just talk just very briefly about the Congresswoman's biography, and then I'm going to offer her an opportunity to make some opening comments about kind of some of the things she's working on and how she's viewing the job right now. I have a few questions I'd like to ask her. And then we've had some submitted questions, which I'll fold into the discussion. If people want to submit an additional question, you can do it using the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And I'll do my best to get to as many of the questions that we have today as I can. So let's go ahead and get started. First of all, let me just say again, welcome very much, Congresswoman Luria. Thank you for joining us from Norfolk. It's a pleasure to have you. Congresswoman Luria represents the second district, which is basically all of coastal Virginia. Everything in Virginia, from North Carolina to Maryland, that touches the Atlantic Ocean belongs in the second district. It is one of the biggest military and veteran family communities in the country. In many ways, Congresswoman Luria matches the district very appropriately, with a long career, 2 decades long, serving as an officer in the U.S. Navy, retiring as a commander. She was among the first women to serve the entirety of her career in combat ships, and she now serves on the House Armed Services Committee. She's vice chair of the Sea Power and Projection Forces Committee, and she's also a chairman of the Disability and Memorial Assistance Subcommittee of the Veterans Affairs Committee. So a lot of very specific work focusing on the district and on keeping Virginia strong. But in addition to her distinguished military career, Congresswoman Luria was also a small business owner. And so she's had the experience of conceiving and starting a business, running a small business, and I'm hoping that she'll be able to reflect today with our business community a little bit about that experience, and also what's happening with the small business community in Hampton Roads as they deal with the economic effects of this pandemic. Congresswoman Luria is among a group of very distinguished women national security leaders that were elected in the 2018 cohort from across the country. We were actually very fortunate in Virginia to have 2 of them, Congresswoman Luria and also Congresswoman Spanberger from the 7th District, are both part of that group. And so this is a real exciting opportunity for us to have you today. Thank you so much Congresswoman, for being with us. So let me, you know, obviously there's a lot going on. We have a lot of questions, but let me start by giving you the opportunity to introduce yourself and talk a little bit about kind of what you're seeing right now in your congressional work.
Well, thank you, Glenn, and thanks for the introduction, a little bit of my background and the committees that I serve on now. It's great to be able to join your group today. Would love to be there in person and see everyone face to face, but with the technology we're able to use today, you know, if there's any benefit, I guess it cuts out on travel time. So I'm able to do this very frequently, and you know, folks ask, how are things going? How are you staying connected with people in the district? And you know, it's pretty amazing. I can do a meeting with somebody in Accomack County and then in Williamsburg, you know, within minutes of each other. So within Zoom and a lot of time on the phone, but really working to stay connected across the community and very much focused on small businesses. We have received hundreds of calls and worked through this with constituents, specifically about the payroll protection program, other programs through the SBA, and a lot of the details related to that, and have really tried to work together at federal, state, and local level to, you know, make sure that these programs can get implemented. We've worked very closely with the governor and his administration with regards to the Virginia Employment Commission and some of the challenges that people are having with unemployment. And, you know, our Virginia delegation has been working closely together. Glenn knows this from his time in Congress, but, you know, we're one of the few delegations across the country that meets regularly. We meet every month, all 11 of us, bipartisan, plus both senators, and our chiefs of staff meet every month. So every other week, there's a full Virginia delegation meeting where we're working together on behalf of the Commonwealth. And now on top of that, we're also doing weekly calls with the governor and just had a very productive one last night. I would say that, you know, what we're seeing across the Commonwealth with regards to COVID, the concentration of the number of cases and specifically new cases varies from place to place. I know that we've moved into phase one with the exception of some areas such as Northern Virginia, Richmond, and then here in our district, Accomack County, and that's specifically centered around the outbreaks that we've seen at the poultry processing plants. Our Governor Northam, has worked very closely with the governors of Maryland and Delaware as well for the chicken processing industry on the whole Delmarva Peninsula, because it's very much tied together. And we have, you know, worked at the federal level to bring in CDC teams and the U.S. Department of Agriculture to be very aggressive about testing and ensuring food safety, and that Tyson and Purdue and all of the chicken that you might buy at your local store that's coming from the Eastern Shore is safe to eat, and all of the workers, you know, there in the surrounding communities, you know, have the best amount of testing ability to isolate people and move forward. But Accomack County is the third highest per capita in Virginia, and the highest per capita of all rural counties in Virginia. So there was a very sudden outbreak there, from, you know, a handful of cases to hundreds in a short period of time, and that was centered around the poultry processing industry. But you know, having spoken to local officials and health officials there, you know, they feel like the aggressive testing and you know, very good compliance of the you know, major employers there has helped to start get that under control, and the number of cases has gone down significantly. I could talk a little bit about my work in my first year and a half, and really focus that back to, you know, what is really important here in Hampton Roads economically. There's kind of two main drivers of our economy here, the Navy and DoD. About 42% of our economy is directly related to the Navy and DoD. And then on top of that, we have two major NASA installations. We're the only district in the country that has two independent, separate major NASA installations, both at NASA Langley and Wallops Island on the Eastern Shore. And on top of that, just bordering the district is Jefferson Lab with the Department of Energy. So there's a lot of influence of the federal budget and federal spending on our region and our local economy. So being on armed services and specifically on sea power, I tie it not just to the national defense aspect of that, but it's also really jobs and livelihood of a lot of people here in our region. 1/4 of all the shipbuilding and repair that happens in the entire country happens in Hampton Roads. So, you know, I find it a very good opportunity to be the vice chair of the Sea Power Subcommittee. And then a fellow Virginian, Rob Whitman, in the first district. So his district starts by Williamsburg and runs north towards Fredericksburg and encompasses a lot of rural areas. But between Rob and I, you know, I'm the vice chair of Sea Power. He's the ranking member on the Republican side, and we've worked very closely together on the sea power issues, and also had an opportunity to work very closely together on protecting the health of the Chesapeake Bay. We were able to get $85 million this year in funding for Chesapeake Bay cleanup. That's $12 million over previous years. And he and I also introduced a reauthorization act for 5 years to be able to make sure that we can keep the appropriate level of funding for the Bay. So getting back to our local economy, Navy and DoD is about 40% of the economy. And then right behind that, you have everything that relates to the Chesapeake Bay. So aquaculture, fisheries, tourism, and those are some of the things that we're dealing with right now during the COVID crisis, which have been really hard hit. So on one end of the spectrum, you have Navy, DoD, federal entities, and all the supporting activities for that, which to some degree they're essential. Shipyards are essential workers who've continued on business as usual. But the opposite of that is our travel and tourism industry has just truly been decimated. Demand at this time of year, moving into Memorial Day weekend and the beginning of the summer, has just cut off almost completely. And put on top of that, a lot of the rooms that are sold each night in the Virginia Beach area and all of Hampton Roads are specifically related to Navy and DoD travelers. And that travel has also been cut out. So, hotels at the oceanfront are down about 90% as far as their occupancy is concerned. And that's going to be very challenging for hotels and restaurants in our region and the tourism industry overall, not just at the beach, but the Eastern Shore. The historic triangle in Colonial Williamsburg has actually been even harder hit than Virginia Beach as far as room occupancy for hotels. So that is a very significant challenge as we move forward. Some of the things that I've worked on during my first term, they actually do a report card. GovTrack does a nonpartisan report card on members, and they score people based off the number of bills they've had signed into law and some other criteria, and actually ended up being number 3. I was very surprised when it came out. Out of 435 members, we were successful in having legislation passed this year to help Gold Star families. So families who've lost a family member in combat. I could give a quick background on this because I want to make sure we leave time for questions, but this is kind of one of those full circle moments that I thought was very meaningful. It originally started with a group of widows in Virginia Beach came to me and they said, well, this 2017 tax bill messed something up because one woman, for example, my husband was killed in Afghanistan a few years ago. And the survivor's benefits go to my children. But now my taxes have gone up $6,000, $8,000, and we don't understand why, and can you help us with this? So we did some digging. We went to the Ways and Means Committee, realized that the 2017 Tax Cut and Jobs Act passed by the Trump administration, that had actually increased the survivor's benefits, the taxes on that to 37%. And this was an injustice that we needed to fix. We were able to get that corrected, signed into law. And then I was able to bring the woman, one of the women who advocates very strongly for Gold Star families, I was able to bring her along with me to attend the State of the Union address. And I think it was very meaningful for her to be able to personally thank leadership, both Speaker Pelosi and Leader McCarthy, for making this a priority and for fixing this for Gold Star families. So that's one of the things that we were able to accomplish this year. Was also able to, through the committee, the subcommittee that I chair on Veterans Affairs, pass legislation relative to Vietnam era Blue Water Navy veterans, so Vietnam era veterans who served off the coast of Vietnam and were exposed to Agent Orange. They've never before received VA healthcare. I can't take full credit for this. This has been a battle for decades, but we were able to get that across the finish line and get them the healthcare that they deserve. It's also able to pass a pay raise for disabled veterans, as well as a couple pieces of legislation that were directly beneficial to the community here in Virginia Beach following the mass shooting that we had about, the tragic shooting we had about a year ago here in Virginia Beach. And one of those was also a tax fix specifically for the Victims Compensation Fund. Worked with Senator Warner, and we were able to have that signed into law, much like the legislation that was passed after Virginia Tech, to make sure that the beneficiaries of that fund will not have any tax implications. And there's a few more things, but I want to leave time, for a discussion. But those are some of the things that I've been working on, and feel like we've built a very strong team, and really eager to win this election in 2020 and be able to continue the work that we've started. So thank you again for having me, and I know that Glenn is going to moderate some questions here, so happy to hear what's on your mind, and
Great.
try to answer any questions.
Well, thank you very much for your opening comments. You have quite a few questions and a lot of interest in engaging with you. So let me try to sort through this, but let me start with, let's just stay on the topic of COVID-19 for the moment, because it's obviously something driving so much of the conversation. And you mentioned some of your legislative accomplishments in your first year in office, and they're quite notable. You run for office with the idea of accomplishing some things, and you really got right to it. And then a crisis happens, and you're forced to address, the unknown. Let me just ask you to comment a little bit on Let's start with the legislative point of view on COVID. And I raised the question about the small business community. So I'm really interested to know sort of what have you seen in terms of the effect side of the first few rounds of legislation, the PPP on small business? Is it helping? How is that working? And what are your sort of observations on how that's playing out? And then if you would comment on the latest rounds of the current effort to put together a funding package, how do you view the politics of that? There are obviously a lot of trade-offs that come with putting together a large package. You want to address the most important things, and you're trying to deal with trade-offs, and you have a legislative strategy. So can you talk our membership through how are you approaching, that, and where do you see this going in the sort of near term?
Sure. So I'll start with the first part of what have we seen in the community. I think I touched on that, kind of how the economy in Hampton Roads is broken down, and where we've seen the most impact is in the travel and tourism industry, obviously retail as well. My small business that I owned up until recently was a retail business with a location in Norfolk and at the oceanfront. So what we've seen is that the payroll protection program, has been relatively effective for some businesses. It doesn't fit the business model for every business, and some of the fixes that we need to work on, which talking about kind of what our next steps are some of the provisions that were put in at the beginning. The 8-week time frame, basically, to use the funds and then bring back employees, has been very challenging, specifically for hospitality businesses when they're still not in a situation that they're able to open their doors, or just now going into phase one, really beginning again to operate at reduced capacity. So really taking feedback from the community about some of these things with PPP, which was, well-intentioned. And we have found that, the majority of small businesses, who have applied for this have been successful in receiving funding. And if they weren't successful in the first tranche, they have been successful in the second tranche. And there's approximately $100 billion remaining in the PPP fund. So there are businesses still applying for that. But there was a lot of hesitation up front because of this 8-week consideration, and specifically with hospitality businesses, they wanted to make sure to time it just right, because they wanted to make sure that at the end of that 8-week period, it would be about the time that they would begin to be able to start reopening. And we need to fix that and make it longer. I think there's broad bipartisan consensus for 12 weeks. Truly talking to our business owners at the oceanfront and looking at the considerations of seasonal businesses where they make over 50% of their revenue in the 3 months in the summer. We really need to look at potentially 16 weeks or even longer, so that people can responsibly spread out that. And then the 75-25 split of 75% needing to go to payroll and 25% to other overhead costs is also very challenging in our conversations with businesses. And we think that there needs to be more flexibility in that breakdown. Aquaculture and fisheries has been hit incredibly hard as well. The majority of the seafood in the U.S. is consumed in restaurants, and then when restaurants aren't open and they're buying much less, especially oysters. We produce we're the largest producer of clams in the country, fresh oysters as well from the shore, and then crabs have been significantly impacted, but less than clams and oysters, because those are mostly consumed fresh. But crabs as well as all of the other fishery products have been hard hit. We did succeed in getting $300 million for fisheries for the entire country in the first CARES Act, and that has been woefully insufficient to address the need. That funding is going to go through NOAA, and it was broken down by a formula that we have yet to determine what that formula was, because it is in no way proportional to the economic impact of fisheries within Virginia, which has the fourth highest number of landings in the country. So the fourth highest producer, and we only got 4.5 million to the entire Commonwealth. So that's something that we're dealing with, and also working with the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission to make sure that can have the impact where it can, but it's not enough to help support our fisheries industry within Virginia. And we also work through some seasonality issues. There's legislative things, but then there's rulemaking around the laws that we make. So weighing in with the Small Business Administration, we were very aggressive in weighing in on the seasonality question, because if you look at seasonal businesses and they were asked to calculate what they'd be eligible for PPP off of their period immediately preceding when they applied. But if you ask the tourism business at the oceanfront to use the 12 weeks going back to February, when they basically have no one on staff, but they're starting to ramp up between spring break and Memorial Day, it didn't make sense. Some of them could have literally applied for $2,000 because they only have a core staff of a few people on board. But the SBA did change those rules with a lot of strong urging to allow them to use any 12-week period in 2019 between May and September, so they could actually reflect what their payroll would be during the high period and receive an amount of funds that was significant enough to impact their ability to keep the businesses afloat. We have had challenges with affiliation rules as well, specifically with medical practices. We have a lot of large medical groups like the Tidewater Group for Women, some dental groups where they're essentially all operating under one umbrella, but they're separate practices. But because of SBA affiliation rules, there were challenges in their being able to receive PPP. And we also saw something similar in the hospitality industry where there's multiple hotels that are essentially like under one brand, but they're independently operated. And that restricted them. We did have a carve out for franchises, and so there were some food service businesses, because of the franchise carve out, individual operators were able to access PPP funds, but it was less possible for some of the other businesses. And then the PPP funds for nonprofits in the region, we've heard a lot of success stories for that. That was also able to be accessed by churches, which truly are relatively significant employers when you look at all of the other services that they provide, such as childcare and other community services. So we've had success stories there, both big and small, as far as those type of nonprofits. I think that it was, imperfect in its inception. I've gone through a list of things that we need to work on, and it looks like moving forward next week we are going to vote on some legislation that will fix some of these issues within the PPP. And my vision is that it needs to be retroactive back to the very first people who accessed it. Because if there's inconsistencies in the time frame between when people accessed it in the first tranche versus the second tranche. And we also need to look very carefully at the forgiveness provisions. The SBA did actually it was last Friday, issue the form that's basically required for people to submit for their loan forgiveness. And we need to very carefully examine that that's consistent, and if there's any changes required in there as well that would make sure to encompass the largest number of businesses who legitimately are trying to stay afloat and use these funds responsibly and be able to bring back their staff. Those are some of the issues related to what we've seen in the district. We've interfaced with hundreds of small businesses. We actually set up a small business hotline and dedicated part of our staff specifically to answering just these types of questions to help walk people through the process. As far as receiving PPP funding, we found that people who are working with the smaller local banks and credit unions have had the most success in getting funds very quickly. There is a part of the community that is just not, tied in with the same type of banking relationships for very small businesses and minority-owned businesses. And we did, set aside in the supplemental for the CARES Act specific funding for those types of businesses. And, really still are getting calls from the community from some very small businesses that just don't have kind of the expertise, manpower, staff. It might be a small business that has 1 or 2 employees, and they really still need some help in making sure that they can access some of the funds available. As far as looking forward, which was the second part of the question, we've passed 4 pieces of legislation. The third was the CARES Act. The fourth was the supplemental to that. And, all of us were very bipartisan. With the CARES Act, it was passed unanimously in the Senate. We passed it on a voice vote in the House. And then there was broad bipartisan support for the supplemental to provide more funding for the PPP, as well as for specifically hospitals and testing. The third pillar of that, which we can get back to later, that we really need to still do is for state and local government. We did give $150 billion in the CARES Act for state and local government. Virginia's share of that is about $3.3 billion. But what we find is that because that was allocated only to dealing with the COVID crisis, there's not a lot of flexibility for the governor in how he can allocate those funds. And I think that immediately we should look at giving governors more flexibility in how they use those funds, because for small municipalities and towns, providing basic government services, making sure that schools are going to have the resources they need to operate in the fall, and kind of all of the things that local government does for us every day. There's huge challenges due to a loss in tax revenue. So, what do we need to do going forward? I think that we need to significantly look at, what we need to do for state and local funding. The original allocation was only for municipalities over 500,000. In Virginia, the only municipality that qualified independently was Fairfax County. But we have other municipalities in the 300 to 500,000 range with Norfolk and Virginia Beach and Richmond and other municipalities in Northern Virginia that I think we need to lower that that threshold, and we also need to increase the flexibility of what those funds can be used for government services. And I can guarantee you that it's not being used irresponsibly here in Virginia, regardless of what the rhetoric might say about blue states. The governor and his team are very thoughtful and have been very responsible with the funding that they are receiving to try to help the most people across the Commonwealth. We did vote last Friday on the HEROES Act, which was a $3 trillion package. I was disappointed that this was not a bipartisan negotiation when we're looking at $3 trillion. That's a huge amount of money. And I think that there needs to be broad consensus and the smartest way to spend that staggering sum. And I thought that it needed to be focused directly on the most pressing issues related to COVID. And there were a lot of things in there that were not related to COVID, although some of them are very laudable, and some of them were even pieces of legislation that I'm already signed on to co-sponsor. I just don't think that they needed to be part of this package, as they were detractors from focusing on COVID. And I think they were also obstacles to this piece of legislation moving forward on the Senate side. It took a lot of thought, and I also take into consideration feedback that I get from constituents. I tell you that in the days leading up to the vote, we were receiving calls to the office about 5 to 1 against the HEROES Act. And we're not particularly a high volume call office, but 300 calls in 2 days on one issue is a lot of calls for us. And this was not a campaign where it was a recorded message or people were reading a script. They were all individual people either writing or calling with specific concerns about things that were in this package. And if you kind of summed up what were all these things, they were all things that were in there not related to COVID. So both the obstacle of this ever becoming law and the fact that, in a district where it is just very evenly split. I mean, we're about 1/3 Democrat, 1/3 Republican, 1/3 independent, and you kind of have to feel like, as a representative, you have to represent everyone. I made the decision to vote against the HEROES Act. That said, 80% of what is in there needs to be in the next package, and I feel, and talking to Senators Kaine and Warner and other colleagues on the Senate side, that we are going to move forward with a package that includes those key provisions, but this was not the vehicle to do that. And in the end, if you look at the Virginia delegation as a whole, we ended up voting 6-5 against it. Congresswoman Spanberger also made the same decision, based off of some similar things about how to vote on that particular package. But we are working hard on fixes to the PPP and what the next steps should be related to helping small businesses, individuals, the public health aspect of it, and truly recovery. Like, how do we get out of this? Where are the investments and infrastructure and other things that can both put people back to work and help us come out on the other end of this crisis?
Well, thank you for sharing your thinking on the immediate and the HEROES Act and where that's likely to go in the short term. And you mentioned thinking a little bit broader in terms of the longer range recovery. I want to fold in a few questions that we've gotten that are connected to that theme. The theme of not necessarily returning back to status quo, but thinking about how we can go forward from here. And there were a number of questions that were connected to climate change and to air quality. And, we've seen some market improvements, as John Kluwer points out, from New Delhi to Los Angeles in air quality during the economic slowdown. Obviously, we'd like to get the economy running again, but it gives us a chance to reflect a little bit on things we might do better. Norfolk obviously suffers quite a bit from rising sea levels. Climate change is an important Democratic priority and one that you've talked quite a bit about. Can you just talk us through a little bit about your thinking on those topics? And is there a way we can position ourselves now to do better on those than we would have in a kind of a pre-COVID analysis?
Yes, so there's lots of things tied together there, but climate change is real. If you come down here to Hampton Roads, it doesn't even have to rain a lot of times. At a particularly high tide, there's roads that are impassable. And as far as climate change is concerned, I've really tried to take on the loud megaphone of the fact that climate change and the effects of that, sea level rise and recurrent flooding, are national security issues. They impact access to our installations here in Hampton Roads. We have 8 major military installations, and I could name off the top of my head, 6 different access roads to those installations that flood at high tide with a half an inch of rain. And that significantly impacts our ability to continue to operate here longer term. And we really need to make infrastructure investments, on the DoD side relative to those challenges. But the bigger picture is what's the cause of the sea level rise and recurrent flooding, which is climate change. And I think that there's several things that I've been working on relative to, going in a direction that, helps cut CO2 emissions, greener, cleaner energy, and truly another one is, stopping investments and further exploration for fossil fuels. A big thing here in the district that is 100% nonpartisan. I have yet to meet anyone who wants offshore drilling off the coast of Virginia Beach or off the Eastern Shore. And every municipality and county down here in Hampton Roads, their city councils have voted, unanimously to, stand up against, offshore drilling. So, kind of things that I feel like we have an influence on in this realm is, stopping offshore drilling. We have in the House 3 different times during this Congress voted on legislation that would prevent offshore drilling off the Atlantic coast. Those have been included in larger packages, even within appropriations. But once that went to conference and the final bill passed, that did not survive. But we will continue pushing on making sure that we don't continue further offshore drilling off the coast, because I think if we're going towards greener, cleaner energy, investing more in the exploration for fossil fuels is not the direction that we need to go. And if you look at our region, I've already kind of described that, but aquaculture fisheries, a spill like the Deepwater Horizon would have deleterious effects on our coastline and obviously decimate our aquaculture industry, travel tourism, which unfortunately find ourselves already in a difficult situation with that with COVID, but also would impede the Navy's ability to operate off the coast. And the Navy has also strongly stood up and said that offshore drilling platforms in the Virginia Capes operating area, where all of our carrier strike groups and air wings train before deployment, would be detrimental to their ability to operate off the coast of Virginia. Another thing, as far as going greener, cleaner energy things, that I am definitely for. We've seen a lot of development as far as offshore wind. Dominion is developing test platforms with a Danish company called Ørsted, and the governor has been, pushing in the General Assembly, very much to do this offshore wind development. It's the first time in federal waters. So there are offshore wind projects off Block Island and Rhode Island and other places, but the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management has set aside 144,000 acres off the coast of Virginia, specifically for developing offshore wind. One might ask, well, why is the offshore wind okay for the Navy and the oil not? It's the location. I mean, the offshore wind can be placed in a way that doesn't interfere with operations, yet where the continental shelf is and the oil drilling would happen would specifically be in areas that are used for live firing ranges and different things for the Navy. And another area that I believe strongly in is the future development of new generations of nuclear power. I have served in the Navy for 20 years as a nuclear engineer, operating nuclear reactors on aircraft carriers, and believe that we really need to look at a resurgence of the nuclear industry within the country, but with newer technologies, safer technologies, and there truly is a lot of work and development going into this. And in the appropriations process last year, we actually did fund 2 prototype reactors to work through some of these experimental technologies. And the reason I bring this up is, I think that nuclear is part of the equation when we're looking to greener and cleaner energy. So, wind and solar are obviously part of that, but the sun doesn't always shine, the wind doesn't always blow, and you need to be able to maintain that base load. And if we can, and we look across Virginia, I mean, about 1/3 of our power in the Dominion service area is already nuclear, and I think that Dominion should do a better job talking about how much clean energy they are producing, because with Surrey and North Anna, we already have a large percentage of power here that is nuclear. So, those are just talking about some of the things that I've been working on specifically related to, things that would help with the climate change issues and greener, cleaner energy, tying that back to where we are with the COVID crisis and things that, we need to look at. Glenn and I had a conversation earlier before this about let's invest in infrastructure. Well, some of the things that have been kind of the most glaring things that have come out of this is sort of the digital divide, and the fact that there are so many areas that don't have access to reliable broadband. It's rural areas, it's also urban areas, and different pockets of concentrated poverty in cities like Norfolk and Hampton and other areas. And I think that we need to look today that having access to the internet is like having electricity. It's really something that everyone should have access to, and investing in rural broadband is one of those infrastructure type things that I think that when we look at rather than just investing a lot of money and basically either paying unemployment or paying people to stay on the payrolls of businesses that honestly may or may not be able to succeed and continue and be viable in a kind of a new post-COVID world, You know, the kind of idea of infrastructure projects is to both use those resources to put people to work, but have something on the other end of it that helps the broader community. So it's not just roads and bridges and tunnels and here navigation channels, but you know, I think rural broadband or just broadband in general is something that, you know, we have seen the effects of that today when, you know, kids are trying to do their schoolwork but they can't connect to the internet. We have, you know, huge disparities in Northampton, Accomack counties, you know, and in certain areas of Hampton and Norfolk where kids just don't have that access. And, you know, it gets down to the point of like, you need internet to do anything. With the IRS, for example, and, you know, people's ability to check on these stimulus payments, we get all these calls into the office. And these are people who don't have access to the internet, or maybe they're of an age group where they're just not comfortable using the internet, don't have it at home, don't know how to use a computer. And the IRS didn't even have a phone number for people to call. And so we put some pressure on that and pushed, and we might actually be the only congressional district in the country that has gotten this phone number out to people because we were so insistent. But they're like, okay, here's where you can call. And they finally have, you know, provided a phone number so that folks in our rural areas or people who don't have access to internet can call and check on the status of their payments. But, you know, showing that with the census as well. I mean, there's so many things where it's just relying directly on the internet, and we're not going to get there if people don't have access.
Thank you. We've had several questions submitted about politics, 2020 cycle, and your election strategy. And actually, I've received a few really nice compliments about your handling of the office, and also your apparently dealing with your constituent services staff. A few folks have said it's been a great experience. But a lot of interest in the second district now. Clearly, this district is one of the most important, both for helping to hold the Democratic majority in the Virginia congressional delegation in Congress, the Democratic majority in the entire delegation, the Democratic caucus in the House of Representatives. But the second district is challenging, and I'd like for you to help some of our friends in Northern Virginia give some perspective on why that is. You won this district in 2018. There was a 10-year gap from the last member who was a Democrat to hold the district, which was me. And then it was about a 10-year gap before me when Owen Pickett held the district. It is a hard district for Democrats to capture. Virginia, in many ways, was assessed to be turning very much blue in the last couple electoral cycles. But if you look at the data for Southeast Virginia, if you go back to 2016, Hillary Clinton won Virginia by 5 points, but lost Virginia Beach, which is the center mass of the electorate that you represent. She lost it by 5 points. And in 2019, the legislative elections in Virginia, Democrats picked up majorities in both sides of the Hill in Richmond, but we were unable to shift all but one of the seats that we won. We're able to move in Virginia Beach, which was basically almost a coin flip again. We just barely got it to come over the line. So, can you talk about the dynamics of the second district for us, and help us understand why this is so important and why this is such a challenge, even going into 2020?
Well, thanks, Glenn. And you're right. And I know you fought the fight in 2008, and I did it in 2018. And, you know, I'm not sure exactly the forecast when you were going in, but, you know, people were like, this is not a flippable district. And, you know, it took a while for people to realize that, you know, if you ran a strong campaign and, you know, had the resources to communicate the message, that you could win this district, but it's really tough. So if you look back the last 3 presidential races, McCain, Romney, and Trump all won this district under its current lines. Now, it was redistricted slightly in 12 and then again in 16 for various court cases, but with its current borders, McCain, Romney, and Trump all won this district. And there's only 13 seats in the whole country where 3 presidentials, you know, where there's a Democrat in the House right now where that happened. So it's a tough district. I only won by 6,000 votes. Tim Kaine in his 5th statewide election, he only won by 3,000 more votes than I did. So, I mean, this is a really tough district to win. And, you know, if you look at it nationally, it's one of those pickup opportunities that the Republicans think they can take back. You know, if you probably in the top, I haven't seen the rankings recently, but probably between 12 and 15 as far as, you know, priority wise about, you know, how much of a pickup opportunity they think it is. But If you break it down, 6,000 votes is less than 100 votes per precinct, and it's really, tough to get out the vote. And now we have this issue with, it's a COVID crisis. Are we going to be able to campaign kind of in our normal ways of knocking doors and reaching out to voters? So we're really trying to leverage a lot of, new tools and technology to build a good digital infrastructure, and brought a field manager on early who has a lot of experience. She was actually on Mayor Pete's campaign using a lot of the tools that he was successful with in Iowa. We already have people phone banking, we have people texting, and we are recruiting volunteers by the droves. But they really are having to use digital tools, so that does somewhat limit the number of people who want to participate based off of their experience or familiarity with digital things. But we're encouraging everyone to get involved. If you look at the last cycle, this was a $14 million race. So that's a pretty big lift. 8 of it was on my side, 6 of it was on my opponent, Scott Taylor's side. And of the 8 on our side, roughly 5 of that was directly from our campaign. And the remaining roughly 3 million was allied groups, Legal Conservation Voters, Planned Parenthood, Vote Veterans, the allied groups that will come in and work on our behalf, but we can't coordinate directly with them. So I expect it to be a race on that same scale again this time. And I probably will have the same opponent. So Scott Taylor, who I ran against last time, he held the seat for 1 term. And, he's in a Republican primary that's going to happen now on June 23rd. I think he's the presumed nominee. And he's making rumblings that there's a big announcement coming this weekend. So I think that, he's about to get Trump's endorsement. So hopefully he's just tying himself to a sinking ship and all goes well in that direction, because if Biden wins and carries this district, I think that, I will win by a reasonable margin. But I think that it's also possible to win this district and hold this district even if Trump wins. This district frequently splits tickets. If you look at the year that Glenn ran in 2008, McCain won Virginia Beach by a landslide, but Mark Warner won Virginia Beach by a landslide, and Glenn also won too. So, it's really a place where we don't necessarily follow the political trends of the rest of Virginia. And like Glenn mentioned, in 2019, we had pickup opportunities here. There were 4 seats, 2 House, 2 Senate, that were very winnable. 3 of those 4, Ralph Northam won, Tim Kaine won, I won, but we didn't pick them up in 19. So there's a lot of factors going into that. But the whole Second Amendment rights and basically gun issue that we've seen, really becoming front and center. Interestingly, even though about a year ago we had a very tragic shooting in Virginia Beach, the 2A folks have come back in full force, and that has really become kind of an issue that it's not something I'm going to focus on, but I'm sure I'll get attacked on the fact that that I am wholeheartedly behind whatever the General Assembly did. And I obviously believe in common sense gun safety, universal background checks. Those are all things I'm aligned with, but that will be a line of attack for my opponent. A little caveat in there, if you didn't catch it last time around, there was actually a scandal involved in the election. Scott Taylor had tried to get a third-party candidate on the ballot, which it's not illegal to help someone get signatures to get them on the ballot. So his staff did this for a woman named Sean Brown, who had actually also been the Democratic candidate in 16. Little glitches that they forged the signatures, and this came to light.
Right.
So there is a criminal investigation. One of his staff members has been convicted, another has been indicted, and he is still under investigation, even though he claims publicly that he's not. The Commonwealth's attorney clearly says that he is. And so, as far as who becomes the Republican nominee, I think running against Scott Taylor, who has a really bad voting record, trying to take away healthcare from people with pre-existing conditions and bad for the environment. The list is long, as well as this scandal. I think that, it'll kind of be the same playbook as last time. And we did it once, so I think we can do it again, but it's just going to be a lot of work to get our message out.
Well, thank you. It's amazing in the Trump era, what would normally have been considered, I think, a disqualifying scandal now seems to just sort of be an accepted part of politics, which is very sad. And obviously we hope that you're able to prevent Scott from coming back, and look forward to finding ways to help you with that. So thanks for helping us think through, the dynamics there. I did have a couple of questions, and I think I can kind of tie this together. When we're talking about the election and electoral dynamics, we had a few questions about how our delegation can work to protect the U.S. Postal Service. One was connecting it to mail-in balloting and the importance of safe options for voting throughout this year, particularly with the COVID crisis. The legislature in Virginia, obviously, as we know, made it a little bit easier to vote absentee without having to declare a reason. But there's also the question of, is the state prepared if a lot of people want to request ballots? Are we prepared to use the postal system? Will the postal system still be there? And are we prepared to push through that volume of people that might demand to vote by mail? And so would you mind talking a little bit about your support for the U.S. Postal Service in general, and then how can we think about protecting the election? And if there's anything else you want to mention in terms of electoral system reforms that you think might help the functioning of the government. One person asked about whether you supported term limits, or is there anything else you think might help kind of our electoral system work a little bit better? I know it's a lot, but maybe you can kind of unpack some of
the 12-part question.
Yeah.
So as far as the Postal Service, this is one of those things that, we as Democrats have tried to get in each of these packages, and it has been one of those, sticking points coming to a compromise to get a bill passed that has not survived the process with CARES Act or the previous legislation. There is assistance in the HEROES Act, which I said that passed the House, and will, I'm sure, be a bargaining point in future negotiations with the Senate. But I stand strongly behind the Postal Service. The entire Virginia Democratic delegation signed a letter yesterday with that Jerry Connolly led, specifically in support of the Postal Service, and we will continue to push for that as a priority. I think, obviously election security this year, it's very important. We're also in the middle of the census, and the fact that, the census in a COVID crisis, and I think that on average about 63-66% of people in Virginia have replied to the census. That's much higher in Northern Virginia and much lower in rural areas like Northampton, Accomack County. And we would normally have canvassers, enumerators going out, door to door to collect census responses from those addresses that hadn't responded. That's been delayed. But using the mail is an important part of conducting the census. So that's kind of an additional thing this year that's very important. And obviously all of the federal funding that each county or municipality gets is based off their census count. And so it's very important, especially for rural areas that are already challenged to operate their schools and other public services, that they get a good census count to be able to take advantage of funding at the federal and state level based off of that. As far as election security goes, being able to vote safely, well, I'll say I went and voted on Tuesday here in Norfolk. We had local elections, and I think there were 31 places around Virginia that had elections this week. But obviously in a local election like that, much lower turnout. But I did do praise our local election officials because they were very diligent in providing every precaution possible. Everyone was wearing masks. They were continuously cleaning things. They had disposable pens. They had the floor marked off where people needed to stand 6 feet apart. And truly, there's not a thing I could have thought of that would have made me feel more safe, going there to vote. I mean, it felt safer than going to the grocery store, which we're all, doing as we need. But understandably, there are, people who prefer to vote absentee by mail, or, have health conditions where they, are safer staying at home in this current condition. So, I don't foresee a situation where we're going to be able to go to an all vote by mail. I know that, I think a sizable portion of our voting in Virginia will, still be done in person. The General Assembly did pass the legislation for the no excuse early absentee voting, 45 days. They passed that before COVID happened, before any of this was known to us. And this was always something that we were factoring into how we would run a campaign this election cycle, because this general election in November is the first election where that will go into effect. So there's a huge amount of educating the public about the fact that they can request an absentee ballot, that they don't need an excuse. So you used to have to say, I was sick, I was going to be out of town, I'm going to be working, a list of excuses, but you had to attest to that, saying that these are reasons that I can't vote. Now that's not required. So being able to educate people on that, and truly being able to move our entire campaign up as far as when we start talking about get out the vote and other things, was going to drive us to start doing certain things much earlier in the summer than on a normal cycle. And now we're just emphasizing that more because we think that many more people will truly want to vote from home. I can't speak for the Virginia Electoral Board or specifically about the capacity of being able to mail an adequate number of absentee ballots. I mean, I don't see any obstacles specifically to that. It hasn't been brought to my attention that either our local electoral boards or at the state level that they have a concern about being able to fulfill the number of ballots that might be requested. So I'm not specifically worried about a concern there. A lot of times people bring up election security, which is, kind of a separate, but, related to being able access to the polls, ability to preserve our democracy. And, one of the things that I always note is that in Virginia, we went to paper ballots a couple of years ago. So, I think that some of the election security measures that are still lacking in other parts of the country, do exist here for traceability and accountability for the votes that were cast. So I'm not sure, Glenn, if I got every part of your question, but I tried to hit all of them.
We had another question about VA healthcare, and if you could talk maybe a little about your perspective on that, specifically about, is it possible to turn back privatization of veterans healthcare? What about improving staffing of VA hospitals and clinics?
Okay, well, several parts to that. I mean, VA healthcare, being able to meet the needs of the veteran population with timely appointments and being just access to care, I think is the biggest challenge. Veterans who are able to access the VA and are in the system truly do have very high favorability ratings of the care that they receive. And one of the main challenges we have is access to care. I'll give you an example that the VA changed some rules with what was the names of them have changed, but currently we're on the Mission Act, the predecessor to the Mission Act, which was basically to allow the VA to refer people for community care based off certain criteria. And they used a radius from the closest VA healthcare center, and it was 20 miles. Well, if you took a compass and drew a 20-mile radius around the Hampton VA, that included 2/3 of the Eastern Shore. But everyone knows that if you're driving from northern Accomack County to Hampton and you have 2 bridge tunnels and a $13 toll each way, that's not a reasonable, driving distance equivalent to 20 miles if you were just, say, coming from Suffolk or something straight to the Hampton VA. They were able to fix that and change it to driving time and some other criteria that I think are more realistic for community care. But it has truly been something that we have pushed from our perspective from constituents to be able to make sure that they can access care through the VA healthcare system, either directly at the VA or through community care providers and partners. Once those rules changed and it was clear that other healthcare providers on the Eastern Shore, for example, would be able to work with the VA system to provide care to people closer to home, we convened basically a roundtable. We had the VA, the Veterans Health Administration, the Veterans Benefits Administration, the director of our local VA, the director of Eastern Shore Rural Health and of Riverside Hospital on the shore, all come together. And before the rollout of the Mission Act, we talked about how can we make VA healthcare more accessible on the shore for people. And now they've established a partnership with Eastern Shore Rural Health. They're going to have VA providers, directly liaisoning with the healthcare providers on the Eastern Shore. And I think that people have a big fear of privatization, and I do not believe that we should privatize the VA. I think that there's certain competencies within the VA that where they're truly at the leading edge of those things, traumatic brain injury, amputees and prosthetics and things like that, that unfortunately are significant, wounds that are experienced through combat. And they're really the experts and the best people to provide care for those types of patients. But, if somebody needs to get a prescription refilled and they live in Accomack County, do they really need to drive to Hampton to do that for a basic appointment with a provider? Something that COVID has actually helped with on 2 fronts with the VA is they have significantly increased the number of telehealth appointments that they're doing. So they've increased the capacity as far as because telehealth appointments can be done efficiently, and they've increased the capacity of patients they're able to see because they're leveraging telehealth effectively. And also the shortage of staff. The VA has really gone on a hiring spree during the COVID crisis. They've removed some of the bureaucratic barriers to hiring and have greatly improved their staffing during this period. I can't remember the last number I saw, but it was over 6, maybe close to 7,000 healthcare providers have been hired by the VA during the COVID crisis. And there are certain areas that have significant gaps, but they're not unique to the VA, such as mental health, for example. But I think that as the Veterans Affairs Committee, we are looking to make sure that the VA can provide quality health care, both within VA facilities and throughout the community, and that also includes community-based clinics. We've had 2 community-based clinics in Hampton Roads, 1 in Chesapeake and 1 in Virginia Beach, expand recently, both their footprint as well as the number of providers, and we're looking to build another relatively large community-based outpatient clinic on the south side in Virginia Beach. which will help provide access to care. So the notion that they're trying to privatize at the same time that they're expanding, hiring more providers and making themselves more accessible, I think is a misnomer. I know our chair, Chairman Takano, that's kind of one of his biggest concerns. So every time something, smells like this is trying to privatize, very cautious of those types of things, because there is a feeling that there are forces within the current administration and potentially even Secretary Wilkie who has that vision in mind. But I would say that we're standing up against that, but also looking to leverage things like the Mission Act, where we can get the best care closest to home most quickly for our veterans.
Thank you. We've got about 3 minutes left in our session, and many more questions that then I can put to you. But let's see if we can kind of arc ourselves towards a conclusion. And I wanted to let me pull a few threads here. I wanted to ask you to just comment a little bit about the concept of leadership. You spent a career as a naval officer, and I know you mentioned earlier today the prospect of Joe Biden becoming the president and completely changing the sort of leadership trajectory of the country. And I think everyone on this call would agree that's a top priority. We had General Martin Dempsey on an event this week who talked about the fact that, and he wasn't trying to connect us to Trump, but I will. He said that leaders accept responsibility and share credit, and that is a hallmark of good leadership. We have seen countless examples of leadership failure recently, one specifically related to the Navy, I think, with how the Secretary of the Navy handled the question of the USS Roosevelt having to stop and take care, and the captain trying to take care of the sailors. Obviously there's national security implications to how these things are handled. But I'm just curious, maybe as like a closing question, and if you want to broaden it out to any other kind of closing thoughts in the next 2 minutes, talk about your lessons learned in the Navy about leadership and how that fits with the challenges we're facing today.
Well, I think you're exactly right, Glenn. The tone starts at the top. And, truly, I think that our goal in November of 2020 is to have new leadership at the top and get us back on the right course. I don't need to tell everyone here how disturbing so many things that this administration has done, how the tone is, entirely inappropriate for the leader of, the free world, if you want to say that. And, really just looking for predictable, level-headed, reasonable leadership that's willing to compromise and listen to the people who they lead. And I think that is truly Joe Biden. There was a campaign poster I came across back from FDR, and it said, the man with the heart, the party with the soul. And I think, that Joe Biden talks about the soul of our nation. And I saw that older campaign poster and truly thought, this is truly something that, also talks about Joe Biden. And I think that we've, had a leader at the top who doesn't show much of a heart or compassion, and a party that truly, has no soul in what they make priorities, and truly do things that are damaging to the greater public and to our democratic institutions. So, new leadership at the top and with Joe Biden, and would be wonderful if we could have, Democratic majority in the Senate. I think there is a path, but, it's all going to be very tough. And keeping, our Democratic majority in the House, I think will put leadership in a place that we can make changes to get us back on track. And I could talk about this a lot more than 2 minutes, but I know we're short on time. So,
absolutely.
Wanted to wrap up and say that, I am truly honored to be able to serve the 2nd District and be part of the Virginia delegation as a whole, and feel like all of us are doing a lot of, good work. People ask me all the time when they see the headlines, is it crazy in Washington as, is what we see on the national news? And I would say, like, truly it's not. I think I've given some examples today of things that we've done both legislatively and other things that we've been able to do, as leaders in the community. It's not all about passing laws. It's about the things like we did with the VA healthcare system in Eastern Shore Rural Health. It's about, bringing business leaders together. It's about making connections in the community. And all of those are not checked off by a bill becoming law. They're about, presence in the community and leadership and being able to bring people together. And I would say for all of my colleagues in the Virginia delegation, we all focus very strongly on that, and constituent services. And like our team's gotten $2 million back for constituents just, since I've been in office. And I think that, we have a heart. Like our caseworkers talk to someone and really understand that, that $3,000 Social Security payment that they missed makes a huge difference in their life. And they work really, really hard to help people. And we want to be able to continue to do that and the whole spectrum of things we can to help the community. And we would like Joe Biden to be our leader at the top to set that tone.
Well, I want to say thank you so much, Congresswoman Luria. I promised to get you out on time, and so we'll wrap it there. We really appreciate you being with us and joining us from Hampton Roads and being up with us here virtually in Northern Virginia today. Leadership at the presidential level is important, but it's also vital for us to have really good representatives in Congress representing Virginia. Solid leadership with heart like you, and we're really proud to have you as one of our representatives. So thank you for sharing the time with us. Thank you for all the hard work you put in for the state and for the country. And let me just say, as a closing word, since it's Memorial Day weekend and we will spend some time now reflecting on the sacrifices that have been made by men and women of service, I want to thank you for your service, both in your career in the military and your continued service in public office. So we really appreciate you being with us today. Thanks again.
Yeah, well, thank you, Glenn, and thanks for everyone who took time to join us, and hope to meet you all in person when it's clear to do these kind of events again. And just thanks for what you do to support those of us in office, and we're working for you, and we're working really hard to continue to have that opportunity.
Thank you. Everybody stay well, stay safe. Have a great weekend. Bye-bye.